Hello and welcome. My name is Carissa Miles, Associate Director of Alumni Engagement, and I am thrilled to be your host for this session. We're delighted you chose to spend some time with us today. Before we dive in, I would like to mention that there will be an opportunity for Q&A following the presentation. So please submit your questions via the Ask a Question button if you're viewing from our Alumni Learning Consortium landing page. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next few days. And now it is my pleasure to present Jeff Segrave. He is a professor of health and human physiological sciences here at Skidmore College in Saratoga. His main area of scholarly interest lies in socio-cultural analysis of sport. Hence, he embraces an interdisciplinary approach that seeks to study sport at the intersections of history, sociology, philosophy, and literature. His scholarly specialty is the history of the Olympic Games. He teaches classes on sport in American culture, including a class on sport films. Segrave has held several roles at Skidmore, including chair of the Department of Exercise Science, Dance and Athletics, Director of Athletics, Dean of Special Programs, and the women's varsity tennis coach. A native of Birmingham, England, Jeff earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Exeter, a master's degree at Washington State University, and a doctoral degree at Arizona State University. So without further ado, Jeff, I'm going to give you the screen. This is going to be great fun. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks, Carissa. And thanks to all of you for joining me on a podcast. I appreciate many of you probably doing this during your lunch hour, but it's great to see so many names that I recognize: students, ex-tennis players, colleagues, members of the administration, family. It's wonderful to be able to talk to all of you. Particular thanks to Carissa and Jess, who are working behind the scenes here to make sure this all works well technologically. Off we go. I nothing more enjoyable for me than to talk about the Olympic Games. I should also mention I'm really grateful to Skidmore College that has always supported my interest in the Olympic Games right from when I first arrived at Skidmore in 1978, when just up the road in this little village called Lake Placid, we actually held Olympic Games. And that was really my first sort of introduction to the significance of power of the Olympic Games in American culture, and in fact in world culture. So anyway, I'm going to shove 3,000 years of history here into a sort of 45 minute podcast. I do want to touch on a little bit of history. I want to sort of touch on some details and anecdotes, touch on a lot of themes, offer some evaluation and perspective on these Paris Olympic Games, and then give a very little brief nod to the future. This is probably the sign, of course, and the logo that we all immediately recognize. The 5 Olympic rings locked together in a sort of sense of universal peace, friendship, and harmony. It's one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, along with the McDonald's arches and the Nike swoosh. It's also one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive logo to put on your merchandise. And it is, of course, a powerful symbol of the sort of pacifist internationalist movement, the Olympic Games dedicated to peace and international understanding. This is at the core of the Olympic philosophy of Olympism. So anyway, this is, I say, one of the most recognizable universal symbols we currently have. But let's quickly go back to the beginning, because it all started 3,000 years ago, give or take, in 776 BC in ancient Greece in Olympia, when Coroebus of Elis, who was a cook, won the first recorded event we have, which was a one sprint of the stadium. It was called the Stade Race, which is where we get the word stadium. And this is the stadium in ancient Greece, which was unearthed in the late 19th century. And here it is. And you can see the stone starting bulbous there in the foreground. And you can see on the right, on the bank, the sort of stone setting where the judges, the Hellenic would sit to judge some of the events in the Olympic Games. But this is where it all started. And the Olympic Games were part of something much, much bigger than just sport, of course. This is the entrance, and you can see the stadium through the entrance. And this is where the athletes would sort of parade into the stadium for their various events. But again, we need to recognize the Olympic Games was something more than just sport. And this is the anthropologist Ludwig Dubner indicating the sort of the religious significance of the games. And as he wrote, the Olympic Games were sacred games, staged in a sacred place at a sacred festival. They were a religious act in honor of the deity, which was the god Zeus. Those who took part did so in order to serve the god, and the prizes which they won came from the god. The Olympic Games had their roots in religion. So it was part of a religious cultic festival held at Olympia. And this is what the Olympic site would have looked like. This is the creation of the Olympic site. And you can see in the middle there, the great temple of Zeus. And just to the left, you can see the temple of Hera. And on the sort of top left, you can see the palestra where the athletes would train. And on the top very right, there's the stadium where the athletes would go out and do their competition. So these ancient Olympic Games are wrapped up in Greek culture, and they were dedicated to the ascendant deity, which was Zeus. And there he is in all his glory in the temple in Olympia. Now, this is a 41-foot high statue. So if you look at the characters in the foreground there, this is probably close to size, if you will. The statue itself was made of gold, ivory, and ebony. You can imagine what that would be worth today. It is lost. We have no remnants of it. When the site was corrupted, the statue was taken to Constantinople, where it ended in the Great Fire there. So we have no record of it. But this is what the games were dedicated to. The Olympic Games were just one of a group of ancient Olympic Games celebrations, and these were the big ones, the Pan-Hellenic festivals. The Olympic Games, which were started in 776 BC, dedicated to Zeus. The Pythian Games at Delphi in 582, dedicated to Apollo. The Isthmian Games at Corinth, dedicated to Poseidon. And the Nemean Games, dedicated again to Zeus. So there was this sort of cycle of Pan-Hellenic Games, which would bring the Greeks together virtually every year in one way or another in order to celebrate their Greekness, in fact. So this Olympic festival, which included the games, was very much a mechanism to hold the warring Greek states together and a way for the Greeks to celebrate their common culture, their common religion, their common language, their common political system, their common way of life. And it was a way to try and bring some sort of peace and tranquility, at least for a short period of time, among these forever warring, antagonistic, individualistic city-states. And this was the actual calendar, the daily Olympic calendar, the Olympic Games. So every 4 years, thousands of people from all across Greece would trek in this pilgrimage to Olympia to take part in the most sacred ceremony in the ancient Greek calendar, which featured sport, and you can see it here. It would start with a great procession coming from Elis to the Olympic site in Olympia. There would be inauguration of the actual festival on the site. The athletes and judges would all take oaths that they wouldn't cheat, and they would honor Zeus in their participation. On the second day, you had the great equestrian events and the pentathlon. The equestrian events, by the way, were the most spectated of all the ancient Olympic sports. Not surprising because it involved gambling. And again, horse racing has always been significant for the elite, of course, and as it was in ancient Greece. And then you had the great funeral rites for Pelops, one of the Greek deities, and the great sacrifice to Zeus, followed by foot races. And then on day 4, you'd have what was called the heavy events, the wrestling, the boxing, the pancration. It ended up with prize giving and then Thanksgiving to Zeus, which was really a great party. So it was a 5-day celebration honoring the Greeks and their sense of identity as Greeks. And sport was a crucial dimension of all of this. So you can see in this calendar the sort of intermixing of sport, religion, politics, culture as a sort of, as close, at least in the ancient world, to a sort of universal celebration of a common identity among the Greeks. And it lasted for 1,000 years, which is really an interesting story if you think about it. From 776 BC to 393 AD. The calendar changed over the period of time quite significantly. Lots of events were added, some were deleted. But for 1,000 years, the Greeks celebrated their Greekness, and the focal point was these Olympic Games. It all came to an end in 393 AD. All pagan festivals, including the Olympic Games, were banned by the Holy Roman Emperor Theodosius I. But even though the Olympic Games were banned, it doesn't actually mean the end of the Olympic Games. We somehow think the Olympic Games ended in 393 AD, then they all started up again, a century ago with the modern Olympic Games, and that we have this sort of interim period where there were no such thing as Olympic Games. But that's far from the truth. We've had Olympic Games going in one way or another throughout the course of the intervening centuries, or games that call themselves Olympics, which is even true to the modern games today. The games we celebrate today are not the same as the ancient Olympic Games. They serve a very different purpose with very different sports. And all these games that were held in between use the Olympic title as a way to bring cachet, as a way to bring status, as a way to market them, to sell them, to draw interest in them. So the Olympic Games have survived in one way or another, at least in nomenclature, throughout the course of the intervening centuries, from their abolition by Theodosius in 393 until their recent emergence, first starting in 1896, and we'll talk about that a little later. But you can see many of the sort of iterations of games that occurred in the intervening years. The ISO Olympics were sort of remnants of the ancient Olympic Games that are sort of spun off into towns like Constantinople and Antioch, and that were held sporadically during the ancient Greek world. The first emergence in the sort of more modern era is really the Cotswolds Olympics, which were held in England starting in the 17th century by a country gentleman named Robert Dover. This was really an anti-Puritan moment. Robert Dover was a sort of a jolly old English elite who wanted to sort of resurrect jolly old England with its maypoles and fairs and cooking and athletics and sport. And it was very much an anti-Puritan endeavor. Later on in the 19th century here, we have the games at Much Wenlock by Dr. William Brooks, who was a local magistrate who felt that one way of bringing the little community of Much Wenlock and that area of England together was to hold games, and he called them the Much Wenlock Olympic Games, again, playing on the status and cachet of the ancient games. And then we had the Greek Olympics, funded by a Greek millionaire, Evangeline Zappos, and there were 4 iterations of Greek Olympics held in Athens. Again, it was a sort of acknowledgement of the emergence of the modern Greek state and the sense of the Greeks getting a sense of who they were as they were emerging from Turkish domination. And then there were other Olympic Games held really all across the Western world, from places as far as Poznan to Ramlösa in Sweden, to Montreal, to Liverpool, to San Francisco. So we have a lot of examples of games that call themselves Olympic Games that did not endure. What did endure were the modern Olympic Games, founded by a French aristocrat by the name of Baron Pierre de Coubertin. What he did was to internationalize the Olympic Games. All the previous iterations of games have been somewhat local, regional, and national, but they hadn't been international. And in the late 19th century, international sport had emerged on the scene, and Baron de Coubertin played on that development and established this edifice we call the modern Olympic Games. The International Olympic Committee was actually first put together in 1894. The first of the modern games were held in Greece, in Athens, appropriately. And the first inaugural Winter Games were actually held in Chamonix, France, which is one of the examples of the games held in France throughout the modern era. Here's a quick look at least some of the members of the Olympic Committee back in 1984. A very august group of elite, privileged white men who established these games. And here we have them sitting around the table actually in 1896 at the Athens. This is not all of them, this is just some of them. But most of the International Committee were very, very, very elite. They were royalty, they were aristocrats, they were members of the monarchy, the royal families. So very privileged, very elite, very wealthy, and very much connected to the sports clubs that emerged within particularly the Western cultures. And you can actually see Coubertin sitting on the table at the front left there. Here's a more generous picture of him with one of his most famous quotes, which we forever see whenever we bear witness to the Olympic Games. The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not to win, but to take part, just as the most important thing in life is not the triumph, but the struggle. The essential thing is not to have conquered, but to have fought well. Idealistic, romantic, part of the rhetoric that has sold the Olympic Games throughout the course of the 20th and 21st century. Connected to these games, of course, was this sense of ideology. It's called Olympism, and it is encoded in the Olympic Charter. The games are actually dedicated to this goal of Olympism, which is a much broader goal, of course, than just the celebration of sport. And here you have it in a nutshell. This is taken out right out of the current Olympic Charter. The goal of Olympism is to place sport at the service of the harmonious development of man, with a view to promoting a peaceful society connected with the preservation of human dignity. Again, it's idealistic, it's romantic, it's a lofty goal, but these games are dedicated in this way. So in the same sense that the ancient games were intended to bring a sense of unity to these disparate Greek city-states, so the modern Olympic Games have endured because they're dedicated to bringing the nation-states of the world together to share their sense of common humanity. It's a powerful ideology in rhetoric that has served as the wellspring for the Olympic movement throughout the modern era. And we hear reiterated at all stages of the games. Of course, we've heard it over the last couple of weeks in association with the Paris Olympic Games. The International Olympic Committee also works with the United Nations every year to bring a peace resolution to try and enact some sense of peace during the course of the modern Olympic Games. That peace has not always endured, but it's an attempt to try and bring this sense of unity to the world, even if for only a brief period of a couple of weeks during the course of the modern celebration of the Games. And often in logos, we see this sort of sense of unity. I don't know how many of you know where this one came from. Those of you who guessed Rio were quite correct, 2016. This was the emblem for the Rio Olympics. And here you can see, if you look carefully, 3 individuals all locked together in harmony. And the colors sort of represent Brazil, the green, the red, and the blue. Very much the colors of the Brazilian flag. And again, it's this idea of some sort of sense of global unity during the course of the Olympic Games. But let's turn a little bit to France, who have had a significant history with regard to the Olympic Games. First, because the founder was a French aristocrat, Pierre de Coubertin. Secondly, because the official languages of the Olympic Games are French and English. And if you listen carefully during the opening and closing ceremonies for the Paris Games, you would have heard commentary, the official commentary from the floor of the Olympic in both French and English. And again, the inaugural Winter Olympic Games were held in France, in Chamonix, and the French have held the Olympic Games 6 times, 3 Summer Games, 3 Olympic Games. The only country to have hosted more Olympic Games than France, you can probably all guess this one, is the United States. And 1992 Albertville was actually the last Winter Olympic Games held on a 4-yearly cycle. The next Winter Olympic Games were held in 1994, 2 years after Albertville, in Lillehammer in Norway. And that introduced the modern cycle of interlocking Winter Olympic Games, Winter and Summer Games every 2 years. So France has been at the heart of the history of the Olympic Games, of the modern Olympic Games, right from the very beginning. Just a quick couple of anecdotal looks at history. In 1900, the Paris Olympic Games, swimming was held in the Seine, as it was at least to some extent this year. But a lot of the swimming events were actually held in the Seine in 1900. And there were a couple of interesting events. One was underwater swimming, which I think was 100 meters, if I remember rightly. Athletes got 2 points for each meter they swam underwater, and 1 point for each second they stayed underwater. 2 points for each meter they swam underwater, right? And 1 point for each second they stayed underwater. So whoever got the most points over 100 meters won the gold medal. Something that didn't survive beyond the 1900 games, but an interesting event. And here was another interesting event, the 200-meter obstacle swimming. So athletes, swimmers had to swim over a pole, under a row of boats, and over a row of boats. And again, gold, silver, and bronze medal were awarded in the obstacle swimming, which again was held in the Seine. So the Seine has a powerful history within the modern Summer Olympic Games, which is why the Seine, of course, so prominent in these recent games. The reason probably we remember the 1924 games so well, of course, is because they were celebrated in the famous British film Chariots of Fire. And of course, all of you, I suspect, would know immediately Vangelis's theme to the Chariots of Fire, which sort of gave these 1924 games sort of great commercial visibility and success. These were some of the athletes in the 1924 games. I thought I'd show you these just to see how much times have changed. You can see the pairs figure skating above. You can see the toboggans below. These sleds were little death traps. And there are many, many examples of these things flying off the arena out into the woods, into trees. And we have some pretty harrowing stories of the old toboggan runs. And this is what the good old Canadian hockey team looked like back then. A lot different if you look at the NHL teams today. And then Albertville. The reason Albertville sort of is prominent in Olympic history, and somewhat unfortunately, it was an environmental disaster. Unfortunately, many of the sites wrought significant havoc to the natural environment in Albertville and the surrounding area. It was a powerful mechanism for triggering 1994 Lillehammer to accept the games only if the Olympic Games would support a deep and profound attention to environmental preservation. As a result, there are 3 Olympic pillars. It used to be just sport and culture. Now it's actually sport, culture, and the environment. So back in 1994, starting with Lillehammer, Norwegians insisted that the environment become a significant dimension of the Olympic organization, and it has remained so ever since. Sustainability is at the heart of the Paris Olympic Games effort. So a bit of the bidding background, which introduces, again, some significant themes. These were the cities finally really bidding for the 2024 games. Budapest, Hungary ultimately withdrew their bid due to a public referendum, which was clearly not supportive of the games. Hamburg, Germany also withdrew its bid because of a public referendum. And Rome, Italy withdrew its bid, citing financial difficulties. It was a recognition by the French government that the price tag for hosting these games was simply too great at the time. So the IOC was left actually with 2 options, Los Angeles and Paris. Now, if you may remember, Los Angeles wasn't the original city that was going to bid for these games. It was going to be Boston. But Boston ultimately withdrew its bid under enormous pressure from the public, in which ultimately the mayor, Marty Walsh, said he could not guarantee that would not be some expense associated and levied on the public with the Boston Olympics. So Boston withdrew its bid, and Los Angeles jumped in at last minute. And the IOC, facing somewhat dire circumstances, did this sort of interesting double take and awarded Paris the Games for 224 and Los Angeles the Games 228. And Los Angeles gained some significant concessions from the IOC to wait for the extra 4 years to host the next round of Olympic Games. So let's turn a bit to the Paris Games that we've all just witnessed. This is a symbol of the Paris Games. I'm sure you will recognize it. This is Marianne, who, of course, is the personification of the French Revolution. The silhouette of her hair is an Olympic flame. The circle in which she is embedded is the Olympic medal. And the silhouette and medal sort of constitute this powerful logo. It got a little ridiculed in the earlier years when it first came out. Some people thought it looked like Victoria Beckham, David Beckham's wife, Posh Spice. Some people thought it looked better as an advertisement for a dating company or a hair salon. But nonetheless, it has endured, and it is now well-recognized successful logo. These are the Friggies that served as the mascot for the games. We seem to have this somehow indelible need now for having mascots for all these games, but this is the red hat, the Phrygian cap, which is so significant as a French symbol of freedom and liberty. And these are the two characters that sort of embody that. If you look at the one on the right, by the way, you will notice the prosthetic leg, which is a tribute to the Paralympic Games. It's the first time a logo has actually sort of really paid significant tribute to the Paralympic Games. It's a little detail that has been missed by many people. So here we have these summer games that we've all just witnessed. 10,500 athletes from 206 countries, 35 venues all across France, not just Paris, but all across France, 32 sports, 9 million tickets sold. 30,000 police will be deployed, 45,000 volunteers. It says 31 here, but it's more like 45,000. The cost of the Olympic Village was just over $2 million, and the total budget for the game was close to $9 million. But as is the need currently with the Olympic Games, Paris could not host all of it. And so it's become much more of a national hosting as opposed to just a single city hosting, because it's impossible now, either with the Summer or Winter Olympic Games, for one city to cover all of the events. We will never see a Lake Placid again. Lake Placid was problematic enough, but we'll never see a small village like Lake Placid ever again be able to host Olympic Games. It is now really only the major metropolitan areas, both summer and winter, that can really sustain the demands placed upon them by this multi-sport extravaganza. So the soccer and other sports were held in various places, including the sailing, which was held in Marseille, and of course the surfing, which was held in Tahiti. The larger political context for these games, of course, and the context which concerned the organizers, I'm sure you're all only too well aware of. One is the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the second one, of course, is the Israel-Hamas confrontation in the Middle East that always has threatened these games. And the need for security, of course, has now become one of the single most expensive budget items for any Olympic host. 35,000 troops, police, were stationed all around Paris and elsewhere in France. It was the single biggest security effort in French history. Close to $400 million was the price tag for it. It is now a major, mega item. 100 AI-equipped smart cameras were posted throughout Paris and other venues in France to monitor the games. Again, security, as we say in Los Angeles, will become one of the most significant major infrastructural dimensions of hosting a modern Olympic Games. And the security threats you're well aware of them as I are, the state-sponsored threat actors, to use the French Olympic term, hacktivists, terrorists and violent extremists, cyber criminals, and of course, civil risk, unrest and disruptive protests. This is what the security systems now within the Olympic Games are constantly monitoring. There was also some internal political context, of course, in the shadows of which these Olympic Games were held, because the French legislature election was held, as you all know, on the eve of Olympic Games, which concerned some about sort of sense of internal equilibrium in France in being able to organize and host under this sort of political turmoil. Initiated, of course, by the decision of Emmanuel Macron following the surge of the far-right nationalist rally and the left-wing Popular Front that sort of opposed his government. As it turned out, it did not appear to impact the Games, but there were those who feared the internal political turmoil might. And the other things that, of course, concerned the Games were, one, the condition of the Seine, which was monitored routinely, regularly, hourly, to ensure its safety. We all know there was one incident of an athlete who seemed to have got sick because of swimming in the Seine. But nonetheless, events may have been postponed, but the Seine was used as part of these Olympic Games. And of course, there were concerns about the participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes in these games that caused protests on the streets of France earlier on. And then there was the specter of steroid use, performance-enhancing drug use by Chinese athletes, particularly Chinese swimmers, which caused some significant concern in the build-up to the Olympic Games. And there were other issues as well, of course, which impacted these modern Olympic Games, these French Games, which sort of hovered, if you will, over them. But I think there's some significant dimension of these games worth mentioning. One is the opening ceremonies. I mean, can you imagine a better setting from these opening ceremonies? Really quite spectacular. The transformation of Paris into an open-air stadium. The city of Paris became a stadium. And from my own perspective, this was one of the most creative opening ceremonies we have ever seen, if not the most creative. It's the first time opening ceremonies have been held outside the Olympic Stadium, and using Paris with all of its historical buildings and histories as the backdrop to it was a remarkably creative endeavor, which, as we know, highlighted the procession, the Parade of Nations, actually on boats on the Seine. 3.7 miles of the Seine, 300,000 spectators. And the Notre Dame bells rang for the first time since the famous fire as the boats passed by. 206 nations took part in this Parade of Nations, more than those nations assembled at the United Nations, which I believe tallies at 193 at this point. But this is really the reaffirmation of the Olympic Games as a truly global ritual, a truly universal global ceremony, when 206 nations of their athletes paraded down the Seine in the City of Lights as the inaugural moment of the Olympic Games. I just wanted to note the refugee Olympic team, which was an initiative of the International Olympic Committee. So you had actually 37 athletes, I think it was 37 athletes, representing 14 countries, representing 11 countries and representing 100 million displaced people. And a couple of these refugee athletes won medals in these Olympic Games. And of course, many people remember Celine Dion singing on the Eiffel Tower as one of the final moments of these opening ceremonies, which sort of gave us a sort of really significant admixture of the modern and the historical. We had Lady Gaga at one moment and then Aya Nakamura at another. We had heavy metal on the banks of the Seine, and we had opera. And these Olympic Games were very much dedicated to at least portraying the diversity of the modern French culture. One of the great achievements of these games, as you probably may have been aware of, was the gender parity. For the first time, we had gender parity in the number of athletes at the Games. Quick look back in history, in 1896, in the first Games, there were no women. Women were not permitted to take part in the modern Olympic Games, none. 1932 LA still only got to 9%, and even if you look to LA of 1984, still only 23% of the athletes participating then were women. But in Paris 2024, 50% of the athletes were women. We've reached gender parity in that sense. It's worth mentioning only 13% of the coaches in these modern Olympic Games are women. So gender parity may have been reached on the athletic field, but it hasn't necessarily been reached in some of the administrative and other ranks associated with Olympic performances. But this is a milestone, and it does demonstrate the commitment of the IOC over the course of recent years to get to gender parity within the modern Olympic Games. They've been touted as the greenest games ever, and it is part of the sort of the new agenda of the Olympic Committee to ensure sustainability really is adhered to in hosting these Olympic Games. And these are just some of the initiatives that Paris instituted. 95% of the facilities already existed. Los Angeles will do the same. There's already a strong infrastructure in Los Angeles, but here you have it in Paris as well, and that's not insignificant. And again, using existing facilities means that you don't have what is commonly called pink elephants left over. These facilities which simply are just not used and fall into disrepair. The Athens facilities and the Sochi facilities are probably the best examples of that. And there was all sorts of secondary use of materials and facilities. The Olympic Village has now become apartments. Little anecdote, the tables in the Olympic Village were made out of all badminton shuttlecocks. Minor detail, but not of insignificance. And it's hard to not think of the magnificent sights that these games used. Equestrian at Versailles, beach volleyball, the Eiffel Tower may seem a little incongruous in a certain sense, but magnificent historical settings. And the Place de Concorde, we had many events, including BMX biking, which was there. And some new events, of course, to attract the younger generation. And breakdancing is probably the most obvious example in these games. But it's not only we have skateboarding, BMX, surfing, speed climbing, but breakdancing was the sort of new phenomenon of these games. Mixed reviews about it. But again, it was certainly a tip of the hat to the new generation. And magnificent athletic performances. I include here Sidney McLaughlin of Rovaniemi on the top left. The great Swedish pole vaulter Armand Duplantis and that magnificent world record jump he got in the very last. Leon Marchand, the great French swimmer, and I had to include a Brit, of course, Georgia Bell. But to me, the signature success, the signature performance in these Olympic Games was the performance by Sifan Hassan, who won bronze medal. I've got this wrong. It's bronze medal in the 5,000, 10 meters in the marathon. She won 2 bronze and a gold in the marathon. Quite magnificent. She ran 38 miles in these 2 weeks and won the marathon at the very end of it. She'd already run the 5,000, 10,000, won the marathon. Spectacular. And if you think about it, the women run 26 5.5-minute miles. The men run 26 4.5-minute miles. I challenge any of you to go out there and run a 5 or 5.5 minute or 4.5 minute mile. They run 26 of them nonstop. And of course, we had the final ceremonies, and here he is, the Golden Voyager in search of history, the search of the Olympic rings. The significance, of course, the Olympic Games is demonstrated here with these opening and closing ceremonies because they make mythology. These are myth makers, these ceremonies. And I mean myth in the sense of these are stories we tell about ourselves, to make sense of ourselves. So here you have the Olympic mythology, the sort of pacifist, internationalist value of the Olympic Games, transcending the centuries from ancient Greece. And of course, then you have the modern French mythology told through these ceremonies. They affirm, construct, create our sense of identity and who we are. And let's not forget how powerful that is. So on balance, if I could say just a couple of words about how successful do we think these Olympic Games were? Well, of course, like anything else, it depends where you're sitting. It depends on your perspective, your political, ideological perspective. If you're Thomas Bach sitting as president of the IOC, you're thrilled. There was no disruption, no internal protests, no external terrorism. It refreshed the Olympic Games after the COVID Games of previous years. And it reinvigorated the Olympic brand, which is significant for the power and the income for the Olympic movement. If you are a member, the CEO of one of the sponsor programs like Coca-Cola, you're equally thrilled. Half of the world's population watched these Olympic Games at one point or another. Half of the world's population. Talk about a global marketing bonanza. If you're Tony Estongwe, the Paris chair of the organizing committee, you're also thrilled. You enhance the status and reputation of Paris. It's a boon to tourism, boon to the local economy, and it certainly, at least for a period of time, enhanced the sense of French unity and identity. The Olympic Games, the New York Times wrote, a triumph of ambition, lift France from its gloom. That's the power of the Olympic Games. But over the past decades, let's not be Pollyanna about this. We know the Olympic Games have caused significant environmental degradation, human rights abuses, exploitation of migrant workers, and the eviction of the homeless. Pink elephants that have cost the public enormous sums of money. And of course, one of the reasons many cities have recently turned down the Olympic Games is because of private gain at the expense of public expenditure. So if you take an even more critical philosophic perspective, you can also see these athletes as sort of frontline shock troops in ideological warfare. They're surrogate warriors, and they enhance nationalism, a sort of supranationalism, even the chauvinism. It's not a benign internationalism here. We're promoting division, not unification. And it may well be a vacation, a distraction from our contemporary woes, but it means we're not paying attention to the really significant issues of life. And ultimately, it is hard not to agree with my great good friend Jules Bykoff, the Olympic historian, who says this is just another commercial corporate bonanza. It's global capitalism spreading across the world. So how do I feel about these Olympic Games? I feel a bit like Mark Twain when he talked about alcohol, who said something to the effect of, if you're talking about that delightful elixir that soothes the nerves and calms the spirit and excites the palate, then I'm all for it. And if you're talking about that deadly drug that causes addiction and destroys lives and family, I'm all against it. That's my opinion. I'm sticking to it. So I can be a little ambivalent at times about the Olympic Games, but there are two, if not three, dimensions that really I find compelling. One is athletic excellence. Nowhere else do we ever see athletic excellence in such a multitude of sports that we'll typically never watch elsewhere. Who else ever watches BMX bike riding or dressage or even swimming? But we do in the Olympic Games. And it showcases women athletes on the international level. There's no other sport organization that showcases women and Paralympic athletes on the international level in the way that these games do. And the other one is their commitment, at least in rhetoric and to some extent in practice, to peace and reconciliation and global amity. As Thomas Bach said in the closing ceremonies, the Olympic Games cannot create peace, but they can create a culture of peace. That's not unimportant. And it's the one truly mega sport event that is committed to something else other than the sport itself. There is something greater here. So on balance, I find myself hard not to support the phenomenon of the Games. Quick nod to the future. This is what's coming up. Los Angeles in 2028, Milan Cortina in 30, Brisbane, Australia in 32, and then Salt Lake City again in 2034. If you want to go a little bit further into the future, the confirmed bids for 2036 include Nusantara in Indonesia, Istanbul, Turkey, Medellin in India, and Santiago, Chile. So anyway, despite predictions often in doom and gloom about the Olympic Games, they seem to thrive and remain, I would argue, and I've always argued, our most significant global ritual. There is nothing else like the Olympic Games. So in the language of the Olympic Games, merci beaucoup, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions coming in already. And the first being that Paris 2024 is being celebrated as the dawn of the new modern Olympics, emphasizing sustainability, inclusivity, and reimagining the Olympic experience through urban and cultural integration. How does Paris as a host city embody the evolving spirit of the Olympics? And what lasting impact do you think these innovations will have on future games and the global perception of the Olympic movement?
You know, that was beautifully written. I don't know who wrote that question, but it was beautifully written. The Olympic Games, these games have focused on sustainability, inclusivity, and the reimagining the Olympic experience through urban and cultural integration. The artistic director of the opening ceremonies, Thomas Joly, intended to push the boundaries of what it means to be French in an attempt to bolster a much more inclusive France and a much less divided world. Again, you've got to remember these opening and closing ceremonies are really political acts wrapped up in pulsating entertainment spectacle. There's some profound politics going on here in terms of creating senses of identity among a significant population. Again, where these Paris Olympic Games really push the envelopes in significant ways, to me, as far as I can tell, one is in this sustainability, in really trying to make sure these Olympic Games do not wreak havoc on both the human and natural environment. Number two, to really ensure gender parity within the Olympic movement. And it's worth remembering the International Olympic Committee is 40% women at this point. That's not insignificant. If you look at the ownership, for example, of the NFL, you will not see 41% women. So that's not unimportant. The Olympic Games are really trying to push towards gender parity. And of course, the Paralympic Games are coming up. And part of the invisibility of the Paralympic Games is we don't often think about them. We also don't often think about the Cultural Olympiad, which goes on. Which also defines the Olympic movement. So we have these Paralympic Games coming up. We have gender parity in the contemporary games, and we have the Cultural Olympiad, which is going on throughout France, before, during, and after the games, celebrating artistic performances, which again highlights sport and the role of sport, fitness, wellness in contemporary American society. But perhaps the ways these games may have had its greatest impact is in the creativity of the hosting of the games, the sites used and the way it was presented. From all of the reviews I'm reading, people are sort of extolling these Olympic Games as really giving us a moment of joy in a world that has been somewhat joyless. And that they have sort of brought a renewed sense of vitality, not only the Olympic Games, but to our sort of global cultural existence. That may be Pollyanna stuff, but this is the stuff that I'm reading in a lot of the newspaper editorials about the game. So Paris has sort of given us, at least to this point, a powerful, practical, structural, and cultural legacy.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, as we witness athletes breaking records and pushing the boundaries of human capability, is there a point where we might reach the limit of what is physically possible? How do you see the future of competition evolving, and what role do technology and training innovations play in this progression?
Yeah, that's a sort of, in many ways, an unanswerable question, but performance do keep evolving, and the records do keep falling, and most of it is the result of technology. And it's the technology of training, it's the technology of facility, and let's not be naive, it's also the technology of performance-enhancing drugs, that we're now creating super facilities with super technologized athletes, and increasingly technological education of athletes right from the very beginning. I mean, the track in the Stade de France, of course, was of a particular type that enhanced performance. The big conversation is what color actually was it, but notwithstanding that, we're not hearing any athletes complain about it. And again, the new shoes, the new surfaces, the new training methods, the use of technology to monitor, enhance, measure performance, again, use technology to enhance diet, and all sorts of feedback to athletics just keeps raising the bar higher and higher. I never thought we'd see a marathon run 26 sub 5-minute miles, but we keep pushing and pushing. I mean, we're going to be having athletes run close to 26 4-minute miles in the not far distance future. I don't think. I don't know what the limits are, and the more sophisticated we get, and the more resources from national level we put into this, I don't see any limitations in the near future.
Thank you. How do financial rewards for medalists impact athletes who dedicate years of preparation and sacrifice but receive no compensation if they don't win? Is it problematic that competing on the Olympic stage, despite the immense effort required, often resembles an act of service rather than a paid endeavor?
A couple of responses to that. Number one, there are no amateurs in the Olympic Games anymore. They're all professionals, and they are all very well supported for the most part during their training and their careers. What happened when their careers are over? Yeah, unless you gain some really significant cultural identity, LeBron James, for example, or Simone Stiles. Yeah, a lot of athletes will retire without the sort of level of compensation that these athletes get. But during their time of training and their participation, I say the old athlete, the old amateur athlete is long gone in just about any sport as a matter of interest. What we don't recognize often, though, is it's the wreckage left behind that we don't see. It's the athletes that don't make it, who dedicate their lives to it and for some reason or other don't make it at the highest level. And I think we probably all know many, many examples, even among our own friends, of athletes whose dream is to make the Olympic Games and they dedicate their lives to it. And then for some moment, their lives are cut short. They receive no compensation, no acknowledgement, no recognition. There's a wonderful book written by Joan Ryan called Little Girls in Pretty Boxes about the Olympic women's gymnasts and ice skaters who live shattered lives, who never reached the sort of pinnacle that we currently. So we celebrate these 5 women who won bronze, gold medal, as we should, the women athletes. But what's left behind is a wreckage of hundreds of little girls in pretty boxes.
Thank you. The Paris 2024 Paralympics is set to be a groundbreaking event with increased visibility and support. How do you see the impact of these games on global perceptions of adaptive sports? And what are some of the key advancements or challenges that athletes with disabilities face today?
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to seeing these Paralympic Games. They become very quickly invisible for most of the world's population, who lock into the Olympic Games we've just witnessed, but don't pay much attention to the Paralympic Games. It's a bit like the Cultural Olympiad. Most people don't even know there's a Cultural Olympiad, which celebrates sport in artistic form all across the country in hundreds of venues and thousands of performances, but no one knows about it. It's a way to ennoble sport, to sort of link sport and art in some sort of cultural setting. The Paralympics is somewhat the same. They tend to go invisible. And yet, I think we've gained greater respect for. There has been greater visibility. And I think we're beginning to recognize and accept the performance of Paralympics on their own level. You often get this argument of comparing men's and women's basketball, for example, or men's and women's tennis. Again, I think we're coming to recognize that that's comparing apples and oranges. We need to accept these athletes' performance within the context of that performance itself. We can appreciate great women's tennis players in the same way we can appreciate great men's tennis players. We don't have to necessarily compare them. I feel the same way about Paralympics. These are really quite phenomenal athletes who are competing under extraordinary circumstances and biographies that are really quite compelling. And if you look carefully and you look at some of the performances and the records and what they achieve, well worthy of our honor and respect. I'm hoping that the NBC are going to actually broadcast some of these events. I hope there's a better global audience than there's been in the past. I suspect there will. And again, technology has done a great deal to encourage, advance, and support the performance of Paralympic athletes. And we're seeing a much brighter future now than we have for a long time for these athletes.
Great. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
So we've received so many really great questions, but we're going to end with a question about the Olympic rings that are obviously so recognizable. Could you provide more details about the origin of the Olympic rings, who was responsible for designing this iconic logo, and what inspired its creation? How has the meaning and symbolism of the rings evolved since they were first introduced?
Yeah, they were actually introduced in 1914 at the Olympic Congress. They were presented to Pierre de Coubertin in celebration of the 5 previous Olympic Games. They were nothing to do with 5 continents locked in friendship. That is the evolution of the rings. But it was initial. It was just an award given to Pierre de Coubertin, who had engendered the initial Olympic Games and had sustained them politically, financially, throughout the course of his tenure on the Olympic Committee and his sort of leadership of the Olympic movement. As an acknowledgement, here we are in coming up on the next iterations of the Olympic Games, and they've now become sort of fully entrenched institution within contemporary modern culture. They evolved into sort of representing the 5 continents of the world that take part in the Olympic Games, and there they are interlocked in friendship, peace, global amity. So they become a sort of the symbol of the pacifist international of the Olympic Games, but that's not what they were actually designed for. They were designed by, I don't know who actually designed it. I'm not sure we even know that, but we do know it's presented to Coubertin by members of the Olympic Congress to acknowledge his contributions to the Olympic Games. There's something else that was dubbed, this is no longer the case, but initially, because of the colors, continents were identified by the colors. That simply was never the case, and that was never perpetrated by the International Olympic Committee. It was something that somehow gained some legs and went out. The green was Australasia, yellow was South America, blue was the blue bloods of Europe, etc. That was actually never the case. So it has had an evolution. What it's become now, of course, is not only a symbol of, it's become the symbol of the best and the worst of the games, I suppose you could say. It's become a symbol of the notion of global unity, but it's also become, I think, the most expensive marketing logo available today. If you want to put that Olympic symbol on your widget, you're going to have to pay millions and millions of dollars. The program that really serves as a financial infrastructure of the games is called the TOP, T-O-P. It's the Olympic program. And there are different levels, but at the highest level, these companies like Coca-Cola pay, I don't know what it is now, it was $40 million to be the official soft drink of the Olympic Games. Pepsi-Cola is the official soft drink of the Super Bowl. Coca-Cola is the official drink of the Olympic Games. So you can put the symbol on your widget, but you're going to pay significantly for it. So it's evolved from just an award to acknowledging the first 5 Olympic Games to a sense of Olympic pacifism, these 5 continents, and now it's sort of become one of the most powerful marketing logos in the world.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That's all the time we have today. That was a great little nursing of my Olympic hangover. And I know that my family is excited to continue watching the Paralympic Games as well. So thank you for the history and reflections and a little bit of broadcasting too. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I hope you all learned something new. And until next time, stay well and enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.